Hi, I'm Professor Green, and now we'll be talking about business. And so now we're going to get into, okay, why and how can organization or how can countries, Freudian slip there because my passion is companies and organizations less than governments, right? That's why I studied the MBA in international business as opposed to international relations. So, but today we're talking about economy and economic progress and more about governments. So how can governments move things forward? How can Argentina have the opportunity to move things forward? And so you'll see the first two words on this slide are innovation and entrepreneurship. And the author has done a lot of research, and he is finding that, author of this textbook is finding that they are the engines for growth. For a country to sustain long-term economic growth, the business environment needs to be conducive to innovation and entrepreneurial activity. What is innovation? Right? New products, new processes, new organizations, new management practices, new strategies. Who's an entrepreneur? Someone to first commercialize, innovate new products and processes. So, right, we can think of Uber, Amazon, Elon Musk, etc., Silicon Valley. And these two things, innovation and entrepreneurship, require a market economy, right? And so we really need a place where people have high economic freedom and they have high economic growth and richer citizens. A lot of these countries are great places to visit, right? Hong Kong, Switzerland, Singapore, the US, Canada, and Germany. When I was living in Switzerland, I was always so pleasantly surprised to hear that the expats that live there, coming from the UK, from the US, from all over Europe, they love living in Switzerland. And I always said, why do you love living in Switzerland? I like it because I'm Swiss, but why do you like it? And they just said, because we just have a really nice quality of life here. And so these countries have this high economic freedom. And so they have a lot of great growth and then eventually richer citizens. So countries that lack economic freedom fail to achieve this respectable growth. And things like a planned economy, right? When we talked about communism, right? That's where the state owns all the means of production, just like we saw in Eastern Europe. That's when things really start to slow down. So individuals and businesses must have the opportunity to profit from innovative ideas. And here, economist Hernando de Soto, he argues that the developing world will not benefit from capitalism until property rights are better defined and protected. And so this is what I was alluding to a few slides ago in part one, when we talk about no corruption, and we also talk about formalizing the land ownership concept. So there's a statistic that $9.3 trillion in value in the year 2000 was held up in real estate in third world and former communist states because there's no formal way to document if an individual owns a piece of land or not. And when they can say that if they're living on the land or farming on the land, and if they can say legally that they own the land, then they don't qualify for mortgages to buy new things. They can't exchange this land for money, etc. And so Hernando de Soto is really arguing that we need to make sure that these developing nations have a really good way of tracking property rights. And that will really help to move these nations forward. So, what is the required political system? Right, democratic regimes tend to be more conducive, of course, to long-term economic growth than dictatorships, even the benevolent kind, even the dictatorship that says it's going to be nice and be helpful to the people, just like Perón, he says he was going to be helpful, but in the end, it was not. And limiting human freedoms also suppresses human development and therefore limits progress. And some of the fastest growing economies of the past 40 years began as undemocratic governments. We do have to notice that, right? That these were totalitarianism regimes, but they have fostered a market economy and strong property rights. So as we saw, right, China, not all communist anymore. South Korea has moved forward at an amazing speed. Same with Taiwan, Singapore, they call it the Switzerland of Asia, right? And as we were just talking about Hong Kong too, many, many wealthy people have moved to Hong Kong because it has such a nice quality of life. But only in a well-functioning, mature democracy are property rights truly secure. And here, I just also want to mention that, right, Eastern Europe, when it was under the communists, they really fell apart. And if you've ever been to Eastern Europe, you see that they are still catching up, right? Even though the wall came down in 89, 30 years ago, those cities, those places still can be dirty, not very productive, etc. And they're still catching up after those 40 years or so under communist regime. And so here we talk about how economic progress begets democracy. And so what does that mean? It means that democracy is often a consequence of economic growth. We see it in South Korea and Taiwan, that as we started to see this economic growth, that potentially these countries, Freudian slip again, these countries will eventually be forced to move into a democracy. So the next points here say that contributed to the attitude of many Western governments towards human rights violations in China. So it says that if China establishes a free market system, it is hoped that greater individual freedom and democracy will follow. And how this shows up in today is that, right, with I like to always think of the example of fast fashion, right? So here in the United States, right, we buy a lot of clothing from Asia, but we also are trying to make sure that these people working in these factories are being treated correctly. And it's only when the West comes in and it demands that these human rights are being respected that the change can happen. And that the idea and the hope and that is that eventually these people in these developing countries will rise up and have enough power and money then to move into democracy. That is, as the author says, that is the hope. We don't see it completely yet, but that's the direction that it's moving at the moment. And so now the next part of this chapter talks about how geography, as well as education and demographics, and how that all affects economic development. So there's a belief that geography influences economic policy and thus economic development. And that goes back to this economist, Adam Smith. His work was then also commented by economist Jeffrey Sachs. And in the courses that I've taught here at LMU, that Jeffrey Sachs shows up quite a bit. He's an economist out of Columbia University, and he also worked with the Harvard Institute for International Development. And so he here argues that by virtue of favorable economy, certain societies are more likely to engage in trade, which promotes economic growth. And so, right, this means that it starts to say that, like, landlocked countries, their growth rate was reduced when they did a study by 0.7%. So, and then countries that were on a piece of water, a river, or an ocean or sea, that they had more opportunities and they had better growth. He also said that tropical countries grew 1.3% more slowly than countries in more temperate zones. So, right, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, etc., those countries, just because of their geography, they're prone to grow a little bit slower. Interesting, right? But the next line here says, investment in education promotes faster economic development. And this is what I love, because this is where we can take matters into our own hands, right? We can't control the weather very much, but we can control how much education we get for the most part. And so here he's saying that, like that previous economist that we were speaking about a slide or two ago, Amartya Sen, he was saying that investment in education promotes this faster development, and then they can overcome this tropical climate issue, And that's why we see so many countries now, in Indonesia, for example, really making amazing strides going forward, because they have spent a lot of time and energy and money investing in the young people and getting them educated. Right? South Korea, especially too, right? That in the 1960s, Pakistan and South Korea were at the same level with GDP, but South Korea took a lot of time and effort and money and invested in education, and now is way above and beyond Pakistan. So democratic forces are also important determinants of economic growth rate. Also on the slide are the young and growing population. So one thing to address here, the demographics. And if you have an aging demographic, then you have people that are moving out of the workforce, less people to work, more people to tax the system when it comes to healthcare and pensions. So you want to make sure that people are still having babies. You see that here in the United States, the birth rate is dropping. You also see that across Europe and Germany. I always think of the Czech Republic, because in the Czech Republic, in vitro fertilization is included in the healthcare system if you're under 39 years old. If you're having trouble having a child, you get free IVF, because they want to make sure that they continue to birth babies and people can then start to make money and contribute to the economy. So the three trends, states in transition here, there are three major trends in political economy since the 1980s. There's a wave of democratic revolutions that have swept the world. Many previous totalitarian regimes collapsed, right? The Czech Republic and the Eastern Europe being one in many of those. A move away from centrally planned and mixed economies towards free markets. So again, China opening up their borders, which is really, quote, exciting, good and bad, but really exciting for the whole world. And then the third one, a shift back toward greater authoritarianism in some nations, and a sign of retreat from the free market model. And so that's when we can see things like in Argentina, unfortunately, and now in Russia. Really, a really bad situation, obviously, happening in Russia. So we'll talk a little bit about the spread of democracy, one or two more slides, and then we'll end part two. Here, this speaks to how many totalitarian regimes fail to deliver economic progress to a majority of the population. So again, Argentina is a great example. New information and communication technologies have broken down the ability of state to control access to uncensored information. And the example that I'd like here for this one is Egypt in 2011, that there was an overthrow of the Egyptian government because young people were able to spread messages across Facebook. And it was a really big movement, and Egypt, well, still has a lot of terrorism, but for the most part, until recent years, has really been able to continue to move forward after 2011. And then the last bullet point here is that there are economic advances of the last quarter century led to increasingly prosperous and middle and working classes who push for democratic reforms. So again, we talk here in this chapter about how if we work on innovation, entrepreneurship, etc., then society moves forward. There is one last map here for this part, freedom in the world. And the nice thing is that we see a lot of green here. United States, Canada, technically Argentina is green, but not free, right? We do see a good lot of land, right? Russia, a good portion of Africa, yeah, and a lot of the Middle East, unfortunately. So let's go ahead and end this part here, and I will pick up with the next video for part 3 of chapter 3.